Welcome to the second and last of two video lectures on Homer's epic poem, the Odyssey. Okay, so in the last video lecture, I introduced the Odyssey, and we did a deep dive into books 8 and 9. In the second video lecture, we'll do a deep dive into books 10 and 11. And then we'll stop there, and at the very end of the video lecture, it'll be about 40 minutes long. I will just talk very briefly about what happens in books 12 through 24 as well, and end the Odyssey. Okay, so our learning objectives for today, we are going to continue to work with those Greek terms that we've been working through in previous video lectures: nostos, xenia, moira, and kleos. So we're going to continue to identify and analyze threats to Odysseus' homecoming. We talked about a couple of those in the last video lecture. Calypso is a threat. Nausicaa is a threat. They're sort of a benign, good kind of threat because they offer something good in exchange for Odysseus' willingness to give up his nostos, his homecoming. And then we see bad ones too. We see dangerous threats in terms of especially Polyphemus as a dangerous threat to Odysseus' nostos. And we'll talk about more of those as we continue through books 10 and 11. We're going to continue to look at examples of good and bad xenia. Polyphemus, again, an example of bad xenia. The Phaeacians, an example of good xenia. Lots of examples of good and bad xenia. We're going to look at, when we get to book 11, we're going to go down into the underworld, and we're going to find out what happened to Achilles. And we're going to talk about his Moira and his Kleos when we get there. We're going to continue, just like we did in the last video lecture, to analyze the various layers of meta-narrative elements employed. So we talked about Demodocus in the last video lecture. This lecture, we're going to think about Odysseus as a storyteller, and just the various layers of storytelling that make this epic so wonderful. And then, as I mentioned before, key characters, events, themes from books 10 and 11. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into the text. We start book 10. Odysseus has just escaped Polyphemus, right? And he finds himself next on an island of the keeper of the winds, Aeolus. And Aeolus has, the gods have given him control of the winds. And he stays there. We learn that Aeolus lives there with his children. He has 12 children, 6 strong boys and 6 girls. 6 strong boys and 6 girls. And we realize that he's married them to each other. So sisters are married to brothers. We've seen that before in Greek myths. So we sort of just have to, the gods just do that a lot. So there we are. Anyway, he, this king of the winds, gives Odysseus a bag of oxhide leather, ties the gusty winds inside it, so that Odysseus can use those winds to get home. So here we have an example of good xenia. And it says here, for 9 days and nights we sailed, and on the 10th our native land appeared. So here's Odysseus in his, just after the Trojan War has ended. He's lost a bunch of men. Polyphemus ate 6 of his men from his own ship. He lost others before that. He's experienced the Lotus Eaters. Now he's almost home. He thinks his nostos is complete, or almost complete. But he's tired. He stayed up all 9 days, and he goes to sleep. And when he goes to sleep, his men open up the bag, thinking that there's treasure in it that Odysseus is keeping for himself. His men open up the bag, and they get blown all the way back to Aeolus, right? And we're going to see a pattern in the Odyssey where Odysseus falls asleep at the wrong time. And this is just one of those examples that we get. We only get this one example in the books we're reading, but it happens again later too. He falls asleep at the wrong time or at odd times. He decides to go to sleep. And that's an interesting commentary on the Odyssey. All right, he gets back, and Aeolus thinks he must be cursed by the gods. Why on earth would you not get home when I gave you that bag of winds? And he tells him when he returns, get out, you nasty creature. Leave my island now. It is not right for me to help convey a man so deeply hated by the gods. He roared and drove us from his palace. So here's Odysseus now, His men have betrayed him by opening the bag. Maybe he's betrayed his men by falling asleep and not providing leadership. I always wonder, like, why not tell them what's in the bag? Tell them it's the winds that are getting us home. How did they not know that? But they don't, and it's a failure. It's a failure. Next up, Odysseus finds himself in a land called Laestrygonia, and there are giants who live here. So we get the Laestrygonians. So Odysseus, remember, he's sailing with 12 ships. Each ship has lost 6 men now, including Odysseus's 6 men who were eaten by Polyphemus. The other 11 ships, all the others, harbored their ships inside the harbor, crammed close together. I was the only one who chose to moor my ship outside the harbor. So he doesn't venture into the Laestrygonian harbor all the way, and that's an important detail to remember here in just a moment. So he goes up, he meets Antiphates, king of the Laestrygonians, and all of a sudden, these giant-like men come with boulders bigger than a man could lift and start pelting them from the cliffs. We heard the dreadful uproar of ships being broken and dying men. They speared them like fish, a gruesome meal. So this has echoes of Polyphemus. It's the same thing, but now it's all the other 11 ships being attacked. And remember, they're in the harbor. They're all destroyed. Odysseus loses all 11 ships, and he just barely survives with his few men he's got left. My ship was lucky, and we reached the sea, and it was lucky because he had parked outside of the harbor. My ship was lucky, and we reached the sea beyond the overhanging cliffs. The rest, trapped in the bay together, were destroyed. We sailed off sadly, happy to survive, but with our good friends lost. So this is the sort of the next adventure, and this is the most deadly of the adventures, where he loses 11 of his 12 ships that were sailing back home. We think about how this opened with the king of Phaeacia, Alcinous, saying, "Why are you weeping? Did you lose someone at Troy?" And you remember, as I said back in the previous video lecture, Odysseus has lost everybody by the time he gets to the telling the story. And that's important to remember too. Remember, this is that meta-narrative is happening right now. So we're in book 11 of the Odyssey, and that's the part where Odysseus is telling the stories. We got to see Demodocus earlier in book 8 tell stories, and now Odysseus has started telling the stories of his travels to the Phaeacians. So it's a story within a story, that meta-narrative. We'll come back to that. All right, so he leaves the Laestrygonians, just barely himself surviving, and a few of the men on his ship surviving. And next he comes to a place that's going to be a rather pleasant threat to his, or at least eventually it's going to be a pleasant threat. It's kind of in both categories. It starts off as a dangerous threat to Odysseus' Nostos, and then it becomes, perhaps we could say, a pleasant threat. I don't know, I guess that's up for debate. All right, so he comes to the island of Circe, and Circe is another sea goddess. And this part of the story sounds very similar to Calypso. He is going to end up spending a year on Circe's island, and he's going to end up spending 8 years after this on Calypso's island before he gets to the Phaeacians and tells the story, right? So if we're trying to think in our timeline, we had 10 years for the Trojan War, 10 years for Odysseus to get home, and within that 10 years, he spends a whole year, he's about to spend a whole year here on Circe's island with this goddess, and then later he's going to spend 8 years on Calypso's island with her. So of that 10 years it takes him to get home, 9 of those years are spent living on an island with a goddess who doesn't want to let you leave. So he comes to Circe's palace, and he sends a group of his men first. And he sends them led by godlike Eurylochus. That's a mouthful. Eurylochus. And he takes a band of 22 men, and when they get there, they find Circe, and she's surrounded by mountain wolves and lions. And she is a witch. She has witchcraft. She has magic, which is slightly different than what the other gods have, but she still has the same. It's different than what the other gods have. She can do different things than other gods can do, but she's still also an immortal goddess herself. Although without her magic, perhaps a weaker of the goddesses. She is the daughter of Hyperion, the old sun god. All right. So Eurylochus remains alone outside, suspecting trickery. Circe leads the other men in, set them on chairs, and blended them a potion of barley, cheese, and golden honey mixed with Pramnian wine. She added potent drugs to make them totally forget their home. That sounds a little like the Lotus Eaters, but there's more to this magic potion. They took and drank the mixture. Then she struck them using her magic wand and penned them in the pigsty. They were turned to pigs in body and voice and hair. Their minds remained the same. So they still have their human mind in the side of their head, but their body has been transformed into a pig. They squealed at their imprisonment, and Circe threw them some mast and cornel cherries, food that pigs like rooting for in the muddy ground. So Eurylochus runs back to Odysseus, reports he's terrified when he sees what Circe has done to these other men, these other 22 men. And so Odysseus decides he's going to go back. He's going to go back and try to save his men. And Eurylochus tries to stop him. He says, "You're crazy. You don't want to mess with Circe. She's far too powerful." And then as he's going, he comes across Hermes. And we saw Hermes earlier in the Odyssey. He was the one, he carried the message to Calypso saying, "You must set Odysseus free." Now that hasn't happened yet. Remember, our timeline's a little bit weird here because we're talking about events that happened in the first year of the Trojan War. I'm sorry, the first year of Odysseus' homecoming. It'd be a year after the Trojan War has ended. But Odysseus is telling us the story 9 years in the future. So the timeline, you got to keep that in your head where you're at in the timeline. So it's Odysseus talking at the end, almost to the end of his homecoming, 10 years after the Trojan War has ended. But the events of Circe happened 9 years before that. So keep that timeline in your head as you work through books 10 and 11 here of the Odyssey. So he meets Hermes, who appears to him in human shape as an adolescent boy, and he warns him. He says, you cannot take Circe on by yourself, but I can help. So he gives him an antidote that will keep you safe when you go into Circe's house. Now it will tell you all her lethal spells and tricks. She will make you a potion mixed with poison, as we saw. And then, when she strikes you with her long wand, draw your sharpened sword and rush at her as if you mean to kill her. She'll be frightened of you and will tell you to sleep with her. Do not hold out against her. She is a goddess. If you sleep with her, you will set free your friends and save yourself. Tell her to swear an oath by all the gods that she will not plot further harm for you. Or while you have your clothes off, she may hurt you, unmanning you. And I'll leave that. You can figure out what the threat is there, right? So make her promise, give an oath that she will set your men free and not hurt you. And so Odysseus does all of this. We get down, she realizes, you must be Odysseus. This is Circe talking. She realizes who he is because he has the antidote and he has outsmarted her. Although he's outsmarted her with the help of Hermes, with the help of a god, but still, he's made it through. And then everything happens, and Circe does indeed say, "Come to bed with me." And he says, "I refuse to come to bed with you unless you swear a mighty oath that you will not form plans to hurt me anymore." When I said that, at once she made the oath as I had asked. She vowed and formed the oath, and then at last I went up to the dazzling bed of Circe. And we'll leave the rest of that a little more R-rated section now. And after this is all transpired, Circe indeed opens the pigsty, turns the pigs back into men, and they were men, but younger than before and much more handsome and taller. Then they recognized me. Each embraced me tightly in his arms and started sobbing in his desperation. So they're so happy to have their bodies back and to be freed from the bodies of the pigs. All right. Circe frees all the other men, and they go back and they tell the men who are waiting at the ship, Eurylochus is there, and Eurylochus still does not want to go back, and Odysseus is pretty mad at him for a moment. But he's also his friend, and he respects him. He's pretty angry though that Eurylochus doesn't want to obey and return back to Circe's palace. I wouldn't want to either if I'd watched her turn my friends into pigs. All right. So then every day for a whole year we feasted there on meat and sweet strong wine. So for a year he spends with Circe, and she seems to fall in love with him. And it's an interesting story, and it's yet another threat. Well, it's one of the first threats, in fact, one of the first more peaceful threats. Odysseus has a choice. Uh, he can give up Penelope, and he can give up his Nostos, his homecoming, and just live with a goddess on an island the rest of his days. That sounds pretty tempting, right? But Odysseus is human, and he'll say something similar to Calypso. I'm human, and I want a human life, a human Moira. And also, Moira comes into it, too. Odysseus doesn't know that his Moira is to return home, but it is. And he will return home eventually. Although he's going to suffer greatly because of that curse of Polyphemus and how angry Poseidon is with him. All right, anyway, Circe, I said, fulfill the vow you made to send me home. My heart now longs to go. So she says, okay, all right, I will send you home now, even though I love you. But there's something I'm supposed to tell you. I'm supposed to tell you that you have to complete another journey before you can go home. You have to first go to the house of Hades and the dreadful Persephone. Hades is the god of the underworld, and his queen is Persephone. The queen of the underworld. And there you'll meet Tiresias, who's a blind prophet. And Tiresias appears in lots of different myths where he's alive, but this is happening after Tiresias has died and is in the underworld. And you need to ask him for his advice. Persephone has given him alone full understanding, even now in death. Then Circe gives Odysseus the instructions how to get to the underworld here. And he follows those instructions, and he sails down into the underworld so he can talk to Tiresias, and he's told he has to make a sacrifice when he gets down there. So I promised for Tiresias as well a pure black sheep. I took the sheep and slit their throats above the pit. So several sheep, but Tiresias gets the pure black one, and the black blood flowed out. And the spirits come up out of Erebus, and gathered round. This is sad. Teenagers, girls and boys, the old who suffered for many years, and fresh young brides whom labor destroyed in youth, childbirth labor. So you have women who have died in childbirth, right? And many men cut down in battle by bronze spears, still dressed in armor. So all these ghosts start coming toward the blood. And then one of the ghosts is very interesting. It's one of his own men, Elpenor. And he didn't realize Elpenor had died. He was in such a hurry to leave Circe's island that he didn't realize that the night before Elpenor had died, and he had left his body in the house of Circe without a funeral or burial. And as we talked about in the Iliad, that's one of the worst things you can do, is to leave someone unburied. You have to bury somebody after they die and give them proper burial rites. So Elpenor, Odysseus asks, Elpenor, how did you come here in darkness? You came on foot more quickly than I sailed. He groaned in answer, Lord Odysseus, you master every circumstance, but I had bad luck from some god, and too much wine befuddled me. In Circe's house I lay upstairs. Other translations have him sleeping on the roof. Here, our translator has just changed it to upstairs. And I forgot to use the ladder to climb down from the roof. I fell head first. My neck was broken from my spine. My spirit came down to Hades. Odysseus didn't even realize he had lost one of his men. We always say Odysseus is so smart and cunning, but we see a lot of mistakes that he makes too. And maybe that makes him more human, that he makes mistakes. Maybe it's because of the fatigue of having fought 10 years in a war, and his mind isn't as sharp as it once was. But here's another example where Odysseus has missed a detail that someone as cunning and smart as he shouldn't have missed, but he did. So Elpenor says, I beg you, when you sail from Hades and you dock your ship again at Aea, where that's Circe's island, please, my lord, remember me. Do not go on and leave me there unburied, abandoned, without tears or lamentation. So he's going to fulfill that promise. He's going to go back and bury Elpenor, and he promises he'll do that. Then he sees the spirit of his own dead mother, Anticlea. His own dead mother, Anticlea, whom I had left alive when I went off to holy Troy, and he weeps in pity when he sees her. But he can't talk to her yet. He needs to talk to Tiresias first. So he's going to get a chance to talk to lots of different people in the underworld. But first, the instructions were talk to Tiresias. And Tiresias comes, and Tiresias gives him, he drinks from the blood, which allows him to speak. And then he gives him the information he needs to get home. He says, Poseidon will not cease to feel incensed because you blinded his dear son. So that's Polyphemus. And remember Polyphemus' curse that we talked about in the last lecture. You have to suffer, but you can get home if you control your urges and your men. So the first warning is, you're going to come up on an island and you're going to find cows and fine fat sheep there. But they belong to the God who sees and hears all things, the sun god, referring to Hyperion here, Hyperion's cattle. If you leave them be, keeping your mind fixed on your journey home, you may still get to Ithaca despite great losses. But if you hurt these cows, I see disaster for your ship and for your men. Remember, he's down to 1 ship now instead of 12. If you yourself escape, you will come home late and exhausted in a stranger's boat, having destroyed your men. You remember, that was very similar to the wording of Polyphemus' curse of what would happen. And in fact, that we already know, because we're hearing Odysseus tell the story in the future, that he indeed has lost his ship and all his men, and this is going to come to pass, and they are going to, his men are going to end up offending the sun god and eating the cows and fat sheep that they're not supposed to. Okay, and then more instructions. Even after you get home, you're going to have to, and this doesn't come up till book 24 of the Odyssey, but you'll have another adventure after the Odyssey ends that Odysseus is required to go on to appease Poseidon's anger, which he will also have to do, although that's not part of the Odyssey. That comes after the end of the Odyssey. But yeah, this is kind of a foreshadowing some book 24 stuff. All right. So he gets this information, and then his mother. This is where he talks to his mom, and he asks her, how did you die? What happened? Because remember, he's been gone for now 11 or so years. The 10 years of the Trojan War, a few weeks where he dealt with the first adventures, and then a whole year on Circe's island. And now he's down in the underworld. It's year 11 or 12 at this point since he left home. How did you die, mother? And she says, the goddess did not shoot me in my home, aiming with gentle arrows, nor did sickness suck all the strength from out my limbs with long and cruel wasting. No, it was missing you, Odysseus, my sunshine. Rather sad. His mother died from missing him. We also learn where his father, Laertes, is at. We keep hearing Odysseus, son of Laertes. We learn he's still alive, but he lives out in the countryside and isn't very active anymore. Lives kind of just as a poor farmer did. He gets this information from his mother. So he's getting all this information. Then he meets other women. It's women he meets first. So I won't go through all of these, but each one kind of has its own story that it gets. So again, back to that idea of meta-narrative, stories within stories. So you get Tyro and the story of Tyro, but it's embedded in the story that Odysseus is telling to the Phaeacians in the future, which is then embedded in Homer's story that he's telling to us thousands of years later, right? So you get the story of Tyro embedded here, the story of Antiope, the names are always tough, even for me, so when you struggle with the names, that's okay. Alcmene, I have to use my pronunciation. When you come to C's, you're trying to pronounce a C, it's always pronounced like a hard K. There's no soft C's in ancient Greek. So anytime you see a C like Alcmene, and here is Chloris, it's never ch, it's never the soft C. At least that's the advice I've been given on how to pronounce the hard names. Alcmene is the mother of Heracles, Chloris, Iphimedia, Phaedra, Procris, Ariadne. We get these names. You might know Ariadne's it's turned into a spider in myth. And he says, I cannot name each famous wife and daughter I saw there. Holy night would pass away before I finish. So all of a sudden he jumps back into the current storytelling, and he reminds us, I'm in the middle of this huge story in case you got lost, and there's stories embedded in stories. But now he comes back to Alcinous and says, I'm done, I'm tired. I must go to sleep on board the ship beside my crew, or else right here. I'm so tired, I'm about to fall asleep. Remember I said Odysseus, he falls asleep sometimes. And everyone's just silent listening, though. Imagine hearing a story from someone who'd been to the underworld. And Alcinous respects him, but very kindly says, it's not time for sleeping yet. We want to hear more of your story. And he says, you sounded like a skillful poet, like Demodocus or like Homer. This is also, again, it's sort of an embedded praise for the person who can tell stories well. So Homer's kind of reminding us, skillful poets deserve respect. Telling the sufferings of all the Greeks, including what you endured yourself. But come now, tell me if you saw any spirits of your friends who went with you to Troy and undertook the grief and pain of war. The night is long. It's not time to sleep yet. So Odysseus takes a deep breath and says, okay, I'll tell you more stories. You want to hear about the men I saw? I'll tell you now. So he meets, the first one we see him meet is Agamemnon, who came in sorrow with all the rest who met their fate with him inside Aegisthus' house. So you remember Agamemnon from book 1 of the Iliad. Throughout all of the Iliad, Agamemnon's a very important character. He's the one who led the Greek armies as their supreme commander. Even though everyone who went, Odysseus is a king, Achilles is a king, Diomedes is a king. So they're equals, but Agamemnon was the one chosen to be the leader. Agamemnon's going to tell his story, what happened when he got home and he got killed. And we're going to come back, I mentioned this before, after we read the Odyssey, we're going to jump into a play that's just about Agamemnon and about his nostos and what happens to him. And pay attention to the version that Agamemnon tells in the Odyssey. And I'm going to ask you later in the course to then compare that version to the one that we get from Aeschylus, when Aeschylus sort of rewrites the story and gives it a little more complexity. But we'll get there. The ghost of Agamemnon came in sorrow with the rest who met their fate inside Aegisthus' house. Aegisthus is his cousin, Agamemnon's cousin. So he comes home. He recognized me when he had drunk the blood. Agamemnon recognized Odysseus. He wept out loud and tearfully reached out his hands towards me, desperate to touch. I wept, and my heart pitied him. How did you die? What bad luck brought you down? And he says it was Aegisthus, my cousin, who planned my death and murdered me with help from my own wife. And if you remember in book 1, we heard his wife's name. Her name is Clytemnestra. We see it down here as well, Clytemnestra. And she's going to be a really important character in the play that we read, the play by Aeschylus. Together with Aegisthus, his wife helps kill him, right, when he gets home. And that's going to be the stuff of that story. And we also will meet Cassandra in that play. So Agamemnon in book 1 of the Iliad said, I loved Chryseis more than my own wife Clytemnestra, if you remember that line. He ends up with another young woman who he brings home, Cassandra from the Trojan War, and he brings her home with him, and she gets murdered as well. So Cassandra, who deceitful Clytemnestra killed beside me. As I lay dying, struck through by the sword, I tried to lift my arms up from the ground. That she-dog turned away. And we have a word in English for she-dog as well. Our translator's gone with she-dog here, though. I went to Hades. She did not even shut my eyes or close my mouth. So she didn't even do even the most basic burial things you're supposed to do. There is no more disgusting act than when a wife betrays a man like that. That woman formed a plot to murder me. All right, so we're going to get the details on that. This is Homer's version. We're going to hear Aeschylus's version of the story a bit later in the course. All right. So Agamemnon then gives a piece of advice, because now he does not. Agamemnon is sort of an anti-woman, misogynistic voice at this point, and he gives Odysseus advice. I have a final piece of sound advice for you. Take heed of it. When you arrive in your own land, do not anchor your ship in full view. Move in secret. There is no trusting women any longer. And the difference is going to be Odysseus and Penelope are going to remain completely loyal to one another. And we're not reading books 12 through 24 of the Odyssey for this class, but when you do eventually read those on your own at some point in the future, you'll see Penelope as a really interesting character. Very different character than Clytemnestra, who stays 100% loyal. But Odysseus tests her, to be sure, partially because of Agamemnon's tale here. And then Agamemnon asks about his son, Orestes. And there's plays about Orestes, too. He's a really interesting character. Agamemnon has a son who we didn't meet in the Iliad. He was too young to go fight in the war at that time. And Odysseus is like, I have no idea what happened to your son. I do not even know whether he is alive or dead, right? Yeah, he doesn't know. He's been on an island with Circe the last year, and he was fighting giants and cyclopses and escaping the lotus eaters up until this point, right? Then he goes on to meet more men, and these are all names that we've met, that were in the Iliad. Achilles, we know well, and he's going to have a really important conversation here in a moment with Achilles. Patroclus, Achilles' best friend, who died, and the reason why Achilles went into such a rage in book 22 and 24 of the Odyssey, of the Iliad rather. Antilochus, Ajax. So he meets these different characters. And starting with Achilles, and I want to spend some time thinking about what Achilles has to say to him, because Achilles, of course, was our hero from the Iliad, but now he's down in the underworld. Odysseus, you must not comfort me for death, says Achilles. I would prefer to be a workman, hired by a poor man on a peasant farm, than rule as king of all the dead. That's a fascinating statement, because if you remember, Achilles was one of the only human, who had two different Moiras. Everyone else just gets one, and you can't change it. It's just what's going to happen to you. It's your lot in life. It's your fate. But Achilles had two, and he got to choose which one he wanted. A long, poor life without any chaos, where he would be forgotten, or a short life where everyone would remember him after life. And here in the underworld, he says, I wish I was still alive, and I'd rather just be a poor workman on a poor man's peasant farm than being down here and dead. That's an interesting revelation. That goes against the Greek warrior code for Achilles to say that. That's fascinating. We're going to come back to that in class. What about my father? He asks about his father, Peleus, and Odysseus doesn't know. But he asks about his son. I have no news to tell you about your father, but I can tell you all about your son. And his son's name is Neoptolemus. And we are going to read a play later in this semester, here in a couple of weeks, that's all about Odysseus and Neoptolemus. And that play is called Philoctetes. It's by a playwright named Sophocles. So we'll get there. And Odysseus does know what happened to Neoptolemus, because Neoptolemus was old enough eventually. He came to war after Achilles died, and Odysseus went to get him. And yeah, well, I want to jump into the whole story by Sophocles. We'll get there in a couple of weeks, right? And Neoptolemus is an amazing fighter. Neoptolemus, I brought him from Skyros by ship. But yeah, that's all this. There's a whole story there. Sophocles is going to expand on that moment. And when we fought at Troy, he, Neoptolemus, never paused in the great throng of battle. He was always fearlessly running forward, and he slaughtered enormous numbers in the clash of war. I cannot name all those he killed for us. That's his kleos. And Achilles is so proud that his son has this kleos. When we had sacked the lofty city of Priam, he embarked, weighed down with spoils. No sharp bronze spear had wounded him at all. He was unhurt. And Achilles' ghost, delighted to have heard about the glorious prowess of his son, and that would be the kleos that Neoptolemus has earned. We're also going to find, though, Neoptolemus, we get to later, and actually we're going to get a rendition of it when we get to Shakespeare's play Hamlet later in the semester. Neoptolemus kills Priam, and he doesn't do it in a very nice way at all. He actually kills him at an altar, which is the equivalent of killing an old, defenseless man in a church. And that's one of the things that's going to upset Athena too. The Greeks do some horrible things when they come out of that Trojan horse to the Trojans, and that's one of them. And we're going to talk more about that too. So Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, is going to be a very important character that we're going to continue to discuss as the class moves forward. We meet Ajax. Ajax also gets his own play as well. Ajax will not speak to Odysseus, though, because this is all stuff after the Iliad. After the Iliad ends and Achilles dies, you remember Paris gets to shoot him in the heel, and there's the whole story of Achilles' heel. Well, one of the other stories is who gets Achilles' new armor. And there's a big debate whether it should be who's the greatest of the Greeks that are left, and is it Ajax or Odysseus? And Odysseus gets the armor, and Ajax never forgives him. So now Ajax loses it. There's a whole play about what he does after he feels dishonored. He feels his Kleos was taken from him because he's the biggest and the best fighter. And Odysseus is the smartest, most cunning, but shouldn't he get the armor? Ajax thinks, and feels very dishonored. He gets his own play, and that's a whole other story. Stories within stories, that meta narrative quality. Then we get some other mythical figures that Odysseus meets down in the underworld. Minos, he gets his own story. Or Orion, you might know Orion's belt is a constellation in the sky. Get a little story about him. Tantalus is a great one. Tantalus is being punished in the underworld, and whenever he stands in a lake, and when he reaches down to get water to drink, the water goes down, so he can never drink. He's always thirsty, and he's always hungry, and there's fruit trees above him, and every time he reaches up for a piece of fruit or any kind of food, the tree pulls it away from him. And so he's always thirsty, always hungry, and he can never drink and never eat for all the rest of time, and that's his punishment. Sisyphus, we see down in the underworld. Odysseus sees down in the underworld, mentions him. Sisyphus every day has to push a giant boulder up a hill, and then watches the boulder rolls back down, and then he has to do it again. And the next day, every day, he just spends pushing this boulder up the hill for no reason, and then it's just pushed back down. He meets Heracles. That's another name for Hercules. That's a Greek way of pronouncing Hercules. So he sees a phantom of great Hercules. This one's a little confusing, and actually you can read the footnote. Do read the footnote. It's a little bit confusing because Hercules also gets to become an immortal god at the end of some versions of his myth. But that's the thing that happens with this kind of meta narrative stories within stories. There are some inconsistencies, and we're going to see those across, and they're just as much fun in ways as the things that are consistent. But this is a little bit of an inconsistency that Heracles would be down in the underworld at this point, but also up in Mount Olympus as having been turned into a god. And there's a kind of an explanation for it down here in the footnote. It's interesting, but so dive into that, take a look at that on your own. And then we come to and then the story ends. He's seen and talked with all these different people. He says more women than he can tell us, and here's more. And then he says, but masses of dead came thronging around with eerie cries, and cold fear seized me. All these ghosts started pouring toward Odysseus and toward the blood that he's poured out that lets them speak and talk. And they all start pouring toward him, and it's terrifying. So then I hurried back and told my men to climb on board the ship and loose the cables. They did so, and off they go, sailing on their way with this information that Tiresias gave them. And that is gonna that comes to the end of the Great Wanderings when we get to book 13, the next book. I'm sorry, when we get to book 12. We've been reading book 11. I saw book 12 here, and it confused me for a moment. We're in book 11, though. Book 12 starts down here. If you're using the paper book, you've got text here, but I deleted it from the PDF and then confused myself with the 12. Anyway, when we get to book 12, in books 12 through 24, Odysseus gets to go home. He gets to face off against those suitors. He gets to see Penelope again after being gone for 20 years. He gets to see his son, Telemachus, who's just 20 years old. He saw him the day he was born, and that was it. Now he's going to see him again. And he gets his homecoming, his nostos, in those books. And it's a great part of myth, an important part of myth. Unfortunately, we're going to keep moving right along with class, though, and thus miss those parts. I want to think just a minute, though, more with my last minute or so, and wrap up by thinking a little further on this idea of meta-narrative and stories within stories, and then extrapolate that into the way that these stories keep getting retold over and over again. And I started alluding to that a few minutes ago when I mentioned Agamemnon. He gets his own play a few hundred years after the Odyssey gets written down. Agamemnon gets a play by Aeschylus. And then Neoptolemus is going to be in a play. That's Achilles' son that I talked about a few minutes ago. And we're going to read a play by him, about him, by Sophocles, called Philoctetes. So it's about a guy named Philoctetes, but Neoptolemus is the other main character, right? And then we're also, when we get to Shakespeare and we have Hamlet, we're going to hear about Neoptolemus again. That's hundreds of years later. These stories keep getting retold. And I want to just point out briefly, they keep getting retold still today. It hasn't stopped. The tradition continues right down to today. So we get books like Madeline Miller's book, Song of Achilles, written in 2012, and it tells the story of Achilles. And then I'm just using Madeline Miller as an example because she's probably the most well-known 21st century author to do this, who retells these stories. And then she also wrote a book, 2020, she comes out with Circe, and she tells the story of Circe, right? So these stories are ones that we keep expanding on, and we get to keep writing. Even though the stories are 3,000 years old, they are not stagnant. They are moving and changing and in flux, and we get to be part of that, both as readers and writers. And that's the idea of the creative writing assignments that we have too in our class, is to take part in that tradition, that meta-narrative tradition of stories within stories and the layers of retelling the stories too. All right, more on that. We'll keep coming back to that idea of meta-narrative and stories within stories and the way that they get retold over the centuries. All right, I hope you've enjoyed these 2 video lectures on the Odyssey and look forward to talking about them with you in class.